confirm the resolution. Contention 1 is early warning systems. Scientific American explains that weather early warning systems are a combination of sensors, seismic stations, and wind and water gauges, which all work together to predict natural disasters before they occur. The University of Berlin explains the importance. Weather forecasting IoT architectures enable such IoT devices to communicate with one another autonomously without the help of any infrastructure, resulting in efficient and coordinated natural disaster response and timely public information. The impact is saving lives. The World Meteorological Association explains that in the past 50 years, early warning systems have saved more than 1 million lives per decade. Specifically, they have reduced the 10-year natural disaster death toll from 3 million down to only 250,000. These systems are only set to improve with the continued proliferation of the Internet of Things. IoT analyst Ryan Whitman explains that the development of a new underwater internet will allow for the submersion of many formerly floating devices such as buoys. This in turn will allow for not only an unprecedented amount of data to be gathered, but has the potential to massively improve the quality of gathered data, reducing false positives and increasing the reliability of these warning systems. Contention 2 is data-driven innovation. As sensors spread across almost every industry, the Internet of Things is going to trigger a massive influx of big data. This is already happening, as the EMC Corporation explains that data is currently increasing at an exponential rate. They conclude that by 2020, IoT-generated data will have increased by tenfold. Data drives our information economy. As Wired magazine explains, the rise of the modern industrial economies is almost always accompanied by the rise of institutions that provide data. When businesses can measure the efficacy of their products, they have unprecedented room to innovate and design solutions to our problems. The McKinsey Institute concludes that big data will become a key basis of competition, underpinning new waves of productivity growth, innovation, and consumer surplus. The impacts would materialize in every sector. First, in agriculture. Jasper Mohammed of Venture Beat explains that the Internet of Things allows sensors to monitor and automate everyday agricultural practices, providing data that maximizes crop yields. Steve Lohr of the New York Times furthers that such sensors are dirt cheap and almost available to anyone, which empowers small farmers that are currently at a disadvantage due to expensive farming technologies. Will Sarni of the Deloitte University Press quantifies that the IoT has the potential to increase agricultural yields by 70% by 2050 and decrease food prices by more than 300%. Second is in the economy. Big data and the innovation it generates would revolutionize the economy. As Stanford University explains, global innovation is the driving force of economic growth in the developing world and the only sustainable means of economic growth at home in developed countries. The framers were correct to refer to the IoT as the fourth industrial revolution. As Adam Thierry of the GNU Mercatus Center explains, the total global economic impact of new IoT technologies could generate up to $14.4 trillion in value per year within the next 10 years. This would account for nearly a 20% increase in global GDP, a value which would only continue to increase every single year. According to the OECD, a typical estimate from cross-country studies is that a 10% increase in a country's GDP alone will reduce the poverty rate by up to 30%. They conclude that this would be the most effective anti-poverty program ever in existence. Third is the environment. Data-driven technology reduces emissions and energy use through machine learning. Patel of McKinsey University finds that the Internet of Things devices have the ability to precisely monitor marginal changes in energy level by comparing current energy usage against the optimal level needed. This allows the device to self-correct excess energy use and maximize efficiency while minimizing waste. The International Energy Agency reports that the Internet of Things could reduce energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions both by nearly 20%. Such a decrease in emissions would not only delay the effects of global warming for decades, but also directly save human lives by decreasing the amount of toxic pollutants in our air. Sarah Zelensky of the Smithsonian explains that 3 million people die every year from these dangerous microparticles, most notably carbon, and she concludes that the problem can only be solved through more efficient technology, which is exactly what the IoT does. Vote for progress. Vote pro.
20% increase in GDP and 20% decrease in emissions.
Yeah, we'll show those to you right before rebuttal. Also,
Wait, 20% increase in GDP.
And 20%.
That's 14.4 trillion. And the total, do you want to see?
You guys just calculate the 20% number then?
we have two cards, yeah.
Yeah, we have
Okay.
two cards if you want to see it.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we'll show you that right before rebuttal.
Don't worry, I got an A- in AP
Can I
Econ.
use a full crossfire actually?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Is everyone ready?
Mm-hmm.
We negate. Our first and only contention is that the Internet of Things will become a tool of mass surveillance. The Internet of Things entails a rapid expansion of massive sensor networks embedded in everyday objects, ranging from location tracking and wearable technology to always-on home cameras. Held Bohr of the McKinsey Institute projects that up to 50 billion IoT sensors will be deployed worldwide by 2020. Unfortunately, as Matthew Alston of Harvard explains, these sensors are the prime mechanisms for mass surveillance, as they allow governments to conjoin data from various sources, creating a singularity of information that is more personal and more dangerous than the sum of its parts. The way governments access our data is by exploiting vulnerabilities. As Peter Denning of the Naval Postgraduate School explains, IoT companies are under tremendous pressure to get their products to market because if they spend too much time developing, market share disappears and costs rise dramatically. Corporations thus minimize security and encryption, releasing technology despite known vulnerabilities 80% of the time. This emboldens governments to access private data. Alston writes that over the past few years, the increased availability of encryption has impeded surveillance efforts to some degree. This effect may be quickly reversed by the Internet of Things, which is creating new and unencrypted channels for mass surveillance. However, even if IoT devices were encrypted, governments would still retain access, simply forcing companies to build backdoors into products for easy access through compulsory legislation. Tim Speroni of Forbes writes that as countries like the US, China, and Russia pursue backdoors, government surveillance capabilities are increasing at alarming rates. Not only does the IoT mean more surveillance, it also makes surveillance more intrusive for two reasons, and the first is by compromising other devices. Unlike conventional devices, the IoT operates on machine-to-machine communication, wherein every sensor in a network transmits data to every other unit. These connections allow officials to infiltrate on one device and use it to collect data from others. Indeed, a 2015 HP Enterprise study finds that as IoT adoption constantly increases, security concerns exponentially multiply. An intrusion on a single device is a gateway that can quickly turn into 60 intrusions. Second is by raising the threshold for what can be surveilled. Conventional surveillance is limited to the digital world, primarily information people choose to disclose online. The IoT, by contrast, bridges technology into the physical world, as Neil Richards of the Harvard Law Review writes that over the next 15 years, the Internet of Things will be increasingly built into our appliances, cars, infrastructure, and homes, subjecting previously unobservable activity to electronic observation and control. For these two reasons, Bruce Schneider of The Guardian concludes that the Internet of Things will give the governments and corporations that follow our every move something they don't have yet: eyes and ears. This in turn ushers us into an era in which everything we do, both online and offline, will be recorded and stored. The impact is discrimination. Kipa Kumar of Rutgers University writes that any expansion of the surveillance state strengthens institutions of racism and classism, as governments tend to focus on minorities due to aggregates of poverty and crime. For example, the ACLU verifies black citizens are 2.5 times more likely to be watched than their non-black counterparts. Malkia Cyril of the Progressive Institute furthers that because disproportionate surveillance leads to disproportionate incarceration, African Americans are exponentially more likely to end up in prison and have fundamentally become intertwined with perceptions of criminality. This effect is certainly not limited to the US, as Gordon Goldstein of the Wall Street Journal writes, overtly racist regimes like Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, and Russia have all designed plans to seize control of the Internet of Things. Michael McKinberg of Georgetown University furthers, autocracies across Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world have historically used surveillance as a tool to repress ethnic minorities and political dissidents. Overall, Catherine Beckett of the University of Washington argues that the most unsurprising consequence of intensifying surveillance is a burgeoning number of minorities suppressed by their governments. As Stephen Marshall of Johns Hopkins University concludes, new forms of everyday surveillance contributes to a statistical rhetoric of minority criminality that operates as a proxy for international discourse on the inferiority of people of color. Thus, Devesh and I negate.
Great.
Get the cups down.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Wait, do you want me to pull them up?
I have them.
Okay.
I need a certain process.
Yeah, sure.
This is the projection.
Just like highlight this was the price you said. This is the total GDP.
Yeah, and then this is
Yep. The second part was increase and decrease in emissions.
yeah, let me get that. I'll start talking about that. Cool.
can have physical.
Yep. Okay. Are computers on net good?
Sure.
Cool. So, alright, yeah, sure.
Okay. So go to your second contention, right? Do we both agree that data will be multiplied through the IoT?
Yes. Okay, so now getting back to my question.
Sure.
Okay, so are any of your impacts like truly unique
Yes.
to internet connected devices? So like, can we agree that you only access a marginal increase in all of these things?
No.
Why?
Because first of all, we tell you that security encryption or decryption increases by 60 times with the HV study, right? But
Okay.
second,
No,
more
no, no,
importantly, we
wait,
tell you.
it talks about intrusions, like hacking
But
access
second,
points.
yeah. But second of all, we also tell you that with IoT, we connect surveillance into the physical world, so the government knows exactly when I take a step and every single action I take, even if I
Is
am
your
offline.
phone not in the physical world?
It
Is
is.
your laptop not in the physical world?
No, I'm not
Is
even
the
talking.
NSA not
hold on,
already
I'm not even
monitoring
talking
you
about
in
technology.
MUA throughout
Hold on.
without the
Really
IoT?
quick, I'm not talking about like a phone or laptop or any other type
I know.
of technology.
I'm
I'm talking
talking
about when I
about that.
step outside of the street,
I know.
even if I am not connected to
When you
anything,
step,
they still know
when
what I
you
do.
step outside into the streets, the NSA knows exactly where you are because there are
How?
cameras everywhere. There are traffic cameras. There are
Wait.
people's phones that they can look into.
Okay.
So you're not
Yeah.
showing me an
Wait,
actual
hold on, really
unique
quick.
increase.
What are those
And if
things
anything, you get
connected
a
to?
marginal increase.
What are those things
They're connected
connected
to?
to?
No, I'm not talking about IoT devices here. I'm saying you only access
Wait,
a marginal
then what are
increase
you
in the
talking
status
about?
quo.
What are
I'm
you
saying
talking
without
about?
the
then?
Internet
You're
of
talking about
Things.
sensors and cameras
No.
that is connected to the internet, and that's how
Business
the NSA access them.
Business Insider says explicitly that cell phones and laptops are not part of the Internet
That's
of
fine.
Things.
That's fine. But
Okay.
you talk about
So
cameras
I'm
and
talking
sensors
about-
outside the streets, right? I'm not even talking about laptops
I know
and cameras.
you're not talking about that. I'm saying you're talking about like surveillance. All of your
Yes.
impacts are also from computers.
No.
Okay? Like you
Wait,
have increasing
David,
discrimination from
David,
computers. You
when
have more
I-
intrusion
David,
from
David,
computers.
David,
Yeah.
When I walk into the streets, I don't like just bring my laptop everywhere, right? The
Right,
camera
there are
doesn't look at me
cameras
all
on
the
the
time.
street.
I'm talking about other people's sensors. For
I know,
example,
I am
if there's a
too.
smart car, then that
Yes,
sensor is going to
great.
detect me even though I have no,
So is the
like, I
camera.
don't even...
So is the camera on the street. Like
Yeah,
you're only
exactly.
access. My point here.
Wait, David, you're
is-
going with our point, right? We're
A
saying that the
camera on the
cameras on the
street-
streets, which I do not even consent to, is able to surveil
A
me, and
camera
that's
on the
connected to the
street.
internet. But we've been going over this for a
Wait,
while.
no, this
Can I have
is
a
really
question?
wait. No, this is really important.
We're not even
a
getting
security camera on the street is not part of the Internet of Things.
Why?
The Internet of Things are everyday
You
appliances.
said the
that are
NSA
now
has
connected.
access to those cameras, right?
Yes.
How do they get access?
They're not part of the Internet of Things because
How do they
explicitly
get access?
the Internet of Things are everyday appliances that are now connected, such as
How do
smart
they get
fridges,
access?
such as iCoffee makers. That's
Okay.
what the Internet of Things is.
Yeah, we're also talking about sensors from cars and every other
Right,
sensor that
cars,
is
not
connected to the
security
internet,
cameras
the
which are
Internet of Things.
designed
Dave,
to
I have a
spy
question.
on you.
Dave,
No,
I have
this
a
is
question.
really important.
You're not getting anywhere with this. I have a
Okay.
question.
Yeah, you can ask.
So who gets the data if it's multiplied by the IoT?
Who gets the data?
Yeah.
The corporations.
Cool. So if the
Okay.
corporations get the data, doesn't that mean they control all the data and they can analyze and do whatever they want with the data?
So they're really disincentivized from doing anything they want with the
Why?
data because corporations are all about profit. And if consumers know that they're doing bad things with their
Okay.
data, they're not going to buy into that
corporation-
They're not going to buy into that corporation.
Sure. If a corporation is able to sell their data for a lot of money, which corporations right now are
So
doing,
then no
that
one
means they
will
get a lot
ever
more
use that
profit, They
corporation
get a lot
again.
more money. That's
This
definitely
is
not
why
true.
Apple.
That's
This
definitely
is
not
why.
true.
This is
Facebook
why
and Google
Apple.
have already
This is
created
why.
backdoors for the government,
This
and they're
is
still
why
making a lot more
Apple
profit.
fought against those backdoors, and this is why Apple said to the government, "No, we're not unlocking the iPhone for
There's a
you."
lot of other companies that have.
Okay. I'd just like to see the ACLU.
Right here. 2.5 times more we targeted 5 big stones.
Yeah, I'll start now. Thank you. We're gonna run a little more prep. starting. That was 50 seconds total. All right, everyone ready? Overview down their case. Starting on Crossfire, like David tells you, they give you no discernible difference between the difference in computers and IoT in terms of discrimination. This is pretty critical because we can all agree computers and cell phones are good, even though they increase inequality and the ability of the government to gather data on race, which fundamentally means they have to prove the difference, prove the bright line for you to vote for this convention. With that in mind, let's go to their surveillance link. First of all, they say there's going to be more data. They're essentially saying that governments intrude when there's less cybersecurity. This is fundamentally false. Governments don't hack into devices. That's not how the government works. They get backdoors built in, which is why the second part of this convention is about backdoors. But corporations don't want massive data scandals, which is why the Reason Foundation found that the vast majority of the biggest players in IoT have already agreed they're not going to build any backdoors, and that's why in the status quo, we don't see any IoT backdoors. Google, Intel, IBM. This is fundamentally important because they don't get access to their impact. But even if you buy the whole thing about like less secure devices from Denning, which is the 80% insecure devices, the fundamental problem is that cybersecurity spending for the IoT is expected to increase twofold in the next 4 years, and it's going to increase exponentially after that because the cybersecurity market for IoT is just as big as the IoT market itself. With that in mind, they give you two reasons why the IoT is uniquely insecure. The first of which is machine-to-machine learning. They fundamentally misunderstand what this means. It's completely non-unique. That's how current hacking works. When you go from one computer to another computer, that's why one hack can shut down millions of computers or millions of devices at once. It's not related to the IoT whatsoever. But second of all, they talk about new types of surveillance. They specifically talk about home applications. I would contend that the data is completely useless. Take my iCoffee machine, for example. So the government now knows I like black coffee and I like it at 8 a.m. That's completely useless. It's not data that they actually can use. But then they say, finally, under this whole link and whole warrant part, that they can now monitor anything. They're essentially saying the government can monitor more forms of data than they ever could before. The fundamental problem is this is completely non-unique. As like the biggest problem is that the first device that somebody buys for their home is not an iRefrigerator or it's not an iToaster. It's a cell phone. And if you already have a cell phone, the government knows where you are, what you're saying to other people, and how you're texting them and what you're talking to them about. Which fundamentally means there is no increase in the amount of data gathered, or at the very least, there is a very minimal increase in the amount of intrusion on privacy, which means this whole convention is completely non-unique. But even if that wasn't true, let's go to their argument on inequality, which is their impact. First of all, the argument logically makes no sense. We can currently already discern age, race, and sex, etc. in person, and it fundamentally is more problematic because according to Columbia University, 87% of people can have their race, age, and sex completely identified by public information, which means if governments really want to discriminate on the basis of race, age, and sex, they can already do it in the status quo. They tell us that they aren't, which means it's fundamentally a problem and a contradiction in this contention. But then they're saying that the government knows that these people are black and then they can discriminate against them. So first of all, like I said, they already know this. And second of all, they never prove how exactly. They talk about the idea of crime, which is illegal, but more importantly, Professor Scott Pepet of U Colorado explains that under the idea of surveillance, choices are easy because race, gender, and age, and other forms of discrimination are already illegal and likely to generate immediate public and sympathetic responses. If an employer, insurer, or the governmental actors begin to use the Internet of Things as a proxy for race or other protected characteristics, legislators and regulators are sure to react, which fundamentally means reform is coming, but it hasn't come yet because the reason being IoT isn't proliferated enough for it to actually be a problem. Obviously, governments, the vast majority of governments in the world don't allow discrimination on the basis of race and sex, which means it's not going to be a problem in the long term. But then, realize that we can already do all realize that the IoT undermines the reason that they're talking about in two ways. So first of all, we reduce inequality through our case. We'll tell you with agriculture, we give small farmers the benefits, and through economics, growth coincides directly with a reduction in inequality, which is why our case tells you that Stanford finds that 1% growth reduces overall economic inequality by nearly 1%, and the benefits of economic inequality are immediately going to outweigh any harm from surveillance, right? The government can't actually do as much of surveillance as they can when you're lifting people out of poverty, giving them more jobs, and fundamentally bettering the infrastructure in developing world. We're bridging the gap between developing countries and the developed world, which is a much bigger impact on inequality than whatever they can talk about. But even then, they talk about the idea of repressive governments using the IoT to oppress their citizens. There's one big problem. Only 30 governments worldwide are considered to be truly authoritarian. So on scope weighing, 9 out of 10 governments will use the IoT for good, to save lives, to benefit their people. And only 1 of these 10 governments is going to use it to actually discriminate and silence political distance, at which point, vote for the affirmative.
Order is going to be their case, our case. Okay. The first contention is early warning systems. 3 problems with this contention. First, it's totally not new because they're saying their early warning systems have already reduced fatalities by 90%. That means they have to tell you how much better these systems are. But second, according to the Wall Street Journal, natural disasters are not predictable. Fundamentally, there is no kind of data algorithm that can take natural disasters in one country and tell us about another. Which means that even though we can use sensors, those sensors don't need internet big data algorithms to work. But third, according to David Rowe of CMS Wire, using IoT for things like this kind of early warning system would lead to a data overload, where we would have way too much data to interpret. It would overload our servers and allow for no interpretation. It decreases efficiency. That's why they prove 0 real-world progress. Now, on contention 2 about big data, 2 prerequisite terms. First, Pepin of the University of Colorado explains that big data leads to more discrimination because corporations abuse the data to discriminate people based off their age, class, but also off their habits and characteristics, which aren't blocked by anti-discriminatory law. That's why Schiller of Brandeis University finds that big data leads to things like price discrimination, where governments literally, or companies literally increase prices for people with certain risk characteristics, don't give healthcare to people who have pre-existing conditions. This kind of data is going to be bad. So he finds that for certain people, they will be paying up to double for the same services because of increases in big data. But second, the big turn here is going to be automation. According to the University of Utah, more than half of all IoT goes into factories in the developing world, and we use this big data to replace other people's tasks. That's critical, because according to PBS, this risks 7 million jobs in the US. But more importantly, 45% of jobs worldwide are at risk due to internet technologies leading to automation. This outweighs because 1, on probability, it's even more likely form of the IoT, but 2, on magnitude, if people lose their jobs, they can't access things like food, like economic benefits, like environmental destruction. That's really key. It's going to be a prerequisite. But then, 3 things. First, they talk about agriculture. 3 problems with this. 1, they give you 0 real-world implementation. Without that, they don't prove you the probability this happens. But second, they tell you from Steve Lohr that this stuff is dirt cheap. The problem is that Lohr is somebody who works for a corporation writing in the New York Times saying, use our technology. Instead, look to the ITU, who finds that agricultural IoT is way too expensive for farmers to develop. And it's going to be near impossible for them to get onto it. That's critical, because according to Boyd of NYU, instead, industrial corporations are the ones who access agricultural IoT. And that's really critical because A, according to the New York Times, when industrial agriculture gets the technology faster, it prices small farmers out of the market and causes them to fall into poverty. But second, and more importantly, according to The Guardian, the world already has 3 times more food than we need to feed all of our people. The reason we have a problem is distribution. If industrial corporations get access to food in the developed world, it only makes the distribution gap worse, which is net harm. But then they reach this Deloitte card saying you increase yield by 70%. The problem with the card is it literally says we need to increase food production by 70%. The IoT will help us get there. It doesn't actually do a statistical analysis saying that it increases yields by that much, and the card inside doesn't even talk about the IoT. But second, they talk about economic benefits. First, cost supply automation again, because even if you increase the economy, if all of those benefits go to the rich, and there's no net benefit. But second, they say there's a 20% increase in GDP. This is ridiculous. Their card says that we get $14 trillion worldwide, and then they say that the US GDP is about 5 times that. So if all of the benefits go to the US, then sure, we increase GDP, but we don't get that benefit. But second, more importantly, again, economic benefits are not inherently good. If the benefits go to the rich, that increases inflation and just makes the poor get worse. They have to prove equitable distribution of resources. Third, on the environmental. Article to the CWR, who finds that, or their own study, from the Carbon War Room, which says that there's an 18% decrease in emissions. The problem with this study is that it doesn't account for rebound effects in the long term, and the study itself says that there's a potential that the emissions can increase. Then, 2 terms. First, Prime of the University of Wisconsin finds that the IoT decreases the cost of energy through efficiency. The problem is that according to Nordhaus in 2016, decreasing the cost of energy increases energy use because people double down on their emissions, especially corporations. He finds that this increases emissions by 230% of the initial decrease. But second, according to Puller in 2016, the IoT itself overloads data centers, leading to huge increases in emission by up to 20% in the industrial sector. And again, another reason to negate.
You ready for crossfire?
Yeah.
Okay, everyone.
I understand you.
So, let's say the government has enough data to know that I'm black, right?
Yeah.
So what are they going to do?
Okay, so you said it yourself, anti-discrimination law blocks discrimination on the basis of race, right? What the PEP evidence you read says is that it doesn't block discrimination on the basis of people's habits, characters, and other characteristics that can basically be linked to people's race, and you need big data to get to those characteristics.
In your own evidence, if you go 2 paragraphs down, it literally says that once this becomes a problem, governments are obviously going to create laws to stop it. I can show you the evidence.
Should create laws. He
not
says
what
that
it
the
says.
current trend is that there is deregulation of the Internet of Things,
No.
and even if governments create laws, those laws are only going to block corporate discrimination. Governments
That's not
themselves
what he
break
says.
their own laws when they conduct surveillance,
Okay.
and it's basically illegal.
So,
Can I have a
okay,
question?
wait. So
Waste of
you
45
never
seconds.
said what the impact was. So the government knows I'm black, right? What are they going to do?
What are they going to? Okay, first of all, it's not about knowing that you're black. It's that once they know that you're African American, if they can conduct surveillance on what you say and what you do, then anything that you do can be construed to be criminal, and then they arrest these people and
They're going to
incarcerate
arrest every black person. That's what's going to happen.
No, that's ridiculous.
Yes, it
You
is
can't just
ridiculous.
trivialize
That's the
racial
impact.
discrimination
I'm
in the
not
criminal
trivializing
justice
racial
system.
discrimination.
Yes, we use surveillance as a tool to find African Americans for petty violations
So
and
wait,
incarcerate
let
them,
me- so
and they significantly
you're saying your
violate.
impact is like arresting people. That's what you're
Our
saying.
impact is the subjugation of minorities across the world, and African Americans are a prominent
You're not being very
example.
specific, but you can ask the
That's the
question.
point. It's not a
Okay.
specific impact. It's not about authoritarian regimes or the U.S. It's about the problem of discrimination. Can I have a question?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So you say from the recent foundation that companies are backing away from backdoors, correct?
Yep.
Where is that happening?
Across the world, the biggest.
It's happening in the United States. What our Forbes evidence says is that these countries then just consent to backdoors in China or India or
Okay.
other countries for financial incentives.
So wait, Apple refuses to like
They
get
gave
into.
the same backdoor in China, for example.
Okay, I
Apple
can
did.
cite you evidence that they didn't, but like
I can
you're
cite you
saying.
evidence that they did. That's
No,
what
no, no,
Forbes
no.
literally said.
That's not what our source says, right? Like here's the problem.
Which
Why
one
would
says?
Apple refuse to have a back? The thing is, giving China a backdoor is the same as giving the U.S. a backdoor.
No, because in
yes.
China there's no regulation, so if they do so, nobody cares. In the U.S.,
No,
it's
no,
a
no, no, no.
public
Giving
issue.
one country a backdoor is the same as giving every country a backdoor
No.
because governments inherently swap data. Like
Okay,
corporations
that's the
aren't
point.
that dumb.
That is exactly the point.
The-
Is that as long as a backdoor happens,
why
we're still
couldn't
gonna
they?
have
Why
things.
couldn't they hack into the Apple iPhone? It's because Apple doesn't give everybody the backdoor.
Listen to me for a second. The reason this became a public issue is the same reason why Apple said no to the backdoor, because everybody knew about it. But 99% of the time when there's a backdoor, people don't know about it. That's why it still happens. Can I have a
Okay,
question or do you
sure.
know?
You can
Okay,
ask a
cool.
question.
So you say that like hacking my coffee maker doesn't lead to discrimination.
Yeah.
Why is this a response if there are other technologies that have microphones, cameras, and location tracking?
So does my phone.
Okay, sure. When an NSA hacks into your phone, right, they have to go through the internet. In your phone, they encrypt certain portions of the data, like where you are and what comes out of the
No,
camera.
phones
In the
aren't.
IoT, there's no
NSA
encryption.
can literally listen to any of your calls. Like that's just
They
false.
get metadata
You
and
completely
then-
misunderstand how this
listen,
works.
They get metadata and then they have to get a court to approve it, but you're missing the warrant, right? There is consent. If you're calling someone, then you get hacked, but if you're not, then you don't. In this world, anything you say can be hacked and accessed.
Okay, we're gonna run for advertising. Wait, you're kicking. Don't go for agriculture.
I agree. Responsibility. We solve for distribution. I just realized that because we encourage we give local farmers the ability to grow more food. They can grow it themselves. There's no more distribution problem.
Do you have a response to automation? That's the biggest problem.
Yeah, because we come to create jobs all around, take people out of poverty. That means if you take people out of poverty empirically, that means creating more jobs in the forest.
Okay, sure.
So you have 30 left.
Ready, ready.
Where are you starting?
I'm gonna go an overview, their overview, and then comments. So first is an overall overview to the case. If I'm always carrying around my phone with me, which is audio and visual capabilities, then the government or corporations gain no additional information from the Internet of Things devices, meaning they access only a marginal increase in any one of their impacts. That means that if we win any one of our impacts, we win the round, because any single one of them that we present outweigh their marginal increase in oppression in countries which are already oppressing people, or in surveillance because they're already being surveyed. But then go on to their overview. First they give you pivot, which is that big data leads to more discrimination. But the only people who can actually use this information to discriminate are the few companies that actually get the the data, and they would have to be going back on their consumers, which would go against their profits, meaning they wouldn't do it. There's no incentive for them to do it and sell that data because they would lose all of their consumers. That means that people will be paying double, and that card doesn't make any sense. But then go on to two main voting issues. The first is agriculture, second is econ. And agriculture, they say there's zero real-world implementation, but it's already in Colombia and in Russia and other countries. But even so, if we don't prove that it's in any single one of these countries, it means that it's because it's a new technology and it will be adopted in the long term because people are finding that they're dirt cheap, and I'll get into that later. So next, they talk about how Lohr works for a corporation writing for the New York Times, but that doesn't refute the statistics. He can't be blatantly lying if the New York Times fact-checked him and published him. They are backing every single thing that they publish. But then go on to Boyd of the NYU. They say that industrial corporations are the ones that access the IoT, but what we do is allow farmers to produce more food by giving them these dirt cheap sensors, which means we actually are solving for that response and for the distribution problem because we're increasing the amount of local farming, which means that because they can grow their own food, they can access a huge increase in the amount of food that they get. But second of all, if we're increasing more food in general, that means that there are less prices, meaning that we're solving for the 500 million people that died in the price hike, which means that we reduce prices, we automatically increase in saving a lot of lives and increase in agriculture yields by 70% and decrease in prices by 300%. Then go on to econ. They have a few responses here. First is automation, and they give them the McKinsey Institute that 45 million jobs are at risk. They say it goes to the rich and that it's not 14.4 trillion all to the US. I'm going to clear this up right now. So basically, GME Mercado Center predicts it's going up by $14.4 trillion, and overall we reduce poverty by 30% for every 10% increase in GDP. We're reducing inequality. That means it takes into account their statistics and finds that overall when you have innovation, you create more jobs than you displace by empowering farmers, by creating new high-level jobs.
All right, so does your card say Internet of Things reduces poverty by 30%?
No.
It says growth.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
The order is going to be our case, some wing at the bottom of our case, and then just turns on the case. Is everyone ready? All right. Start on our case. First, they tell you that security doubles for the IoT, but Middleton tells you that encryption is actually decreasing because the rate of investment on security is going to be a lot slower than the rate of investment on actual technology. That's why 80% of the IoT devices are really insecure. Then they say for our AP analysis that it's on current computers, but current computers don't use machine-to-machine communication. That means that only IoT devices give access to other machines. That's going to be a huge response. But then they said that the data is useless for like home applications, but one home applications allow access into the entire network because of the machine-to-machine communication. But second, remember that most IoT devices have cameras, microphones, and GPS. That's what makes the IoT devices smart. That's going to be a crucial turn. But then they say that there's like a minimal increase in surveillance. But remember that camera sensors in cars, wearables, and smart buildings, etc., gives the government access to literally everything. So you don't even have to be online for the government to surveil you. They literally know every single step you take and every single action you take, even if you don't have a phone or a laptop on you. That's why they increase security. Then they say that IoT is not unique to discrimination, but the bias of the government already exists. We're literally just giving the government a lot more capabilities because now they have a lot more things to work with. That's why they can incarcerate minorities a lot more. Then they say that according modern technology can already discern like race, gender, and sex. But remember, the government have more evidence to discriminate against minorities. They already know who to target, but now again they have a lot more evidence to target those minorities. Then they say that Pepper says discrimination is illegal. But remember that one, discrimination based on habit and character is legal through price discrimination, which I'll talk about later. But second of all, the government is doing the discriminating and not the individuals and corporations. Then they said there's a decrease in inequality by giving small farmers food. But remember again, this IoT is not going to the small farmers. It's a lot more likely to go to the industrial farmers because they get access to the IoT first. That's going to be a huge turn on the small farmers. And finally, say only 30 governments are authoritarian. Remember that we're not even talking about authoritarian governments. Even the United States is discriminating against African Americans. That's going to be a huge reason why I vote for us because we still win on scope. But furthermore, discrimination now is all affirmative options because Alfred Benby of the Disability Studies poorly explains that we have an a priori moral obligation to reject every instance of racism because it's impossible to justify any policy on the basis of saving lives until we value every life equally. He further said because there's a multitude of solutions to any given problem, accepting a racist solution beats complacency and discrimination and prevents us from pursuing more equitable reforms. But finally, remember when they talk about IoT, they're talking about IoT going to the industrial sector. That's why there's going to be price discrimination. That's why small farmers don't benefit. They're going to be displaced, and that's why they're going to be saying that there's never going to be any economic growth going to the small, the rich, the poor countries.
Okay, back this way. If you think of one, I'll ask. Are everybody ready? All right. So, Devesh, remember when you responded to our first contention by saying that there would be way too much data and such that these disaster warning responses would be really slow?
Yeah.
So, like, when you're saying that governments now can hear every single conversation, how are they going to pinpoint the one conversation where a black dude says something self-incriminating?
They're not conducting surveillance on disaster relief.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the logic is the same. Like, you have so much data, why are they going to pick out one person's conversation and arrest them?
Our evidence is talking about data centers. Second, and more importantly, right, we're talking about a data overload because there's metadata. There's information on every tremor in the ground.
Yeah, and this is metadata too. Every conversation and everything that you do. Wait, Devesh, this is really important. This is really, really important.
Let me just explain something about this. So, like, you're right about metadata, but metadata takes up very little space. It doesn't actually cause a lot of overload. Well, can I finish? What causes a lot of overload is if you store video and audio, which takes up a ton of room on any server.
Every single
So, but when you store it equals out though, is what I'm saying. So that's why the logic applies in both scenarios.
We're not saying that the government stores every single video on their server. We're saying that because they have access, they can access certain people's videos, microphones, etc.
Wait. But this is actually exactly the same as it is right now, where Washington Post tells you the NSA can access 100% of your phone conversations.
Okay, so then what's the...
Conversations are different from where you are and everything.
You have location on your phone.
Yeah, like, doesn't your phone have a GPS?
Message you my location.
They cannot access your location.
Of course they can. They turn on your GPS.
Okay, if you don't have your phone with you, can they access anything?
How often do you have your phone? Not
How often do you have your refrigerator with you?
We're not talking about refrigerators.
Like, okay, wait, hold on.
You're trying
The
to-
problem here is that it's not just phones, right? Like, as soon as you walk into the street without your phone, like, there are security cameras which are not part of the Internet of Things that just watch you. Like, that's why how the NSA works. They can use other people's phones too, as long as someone has a phone near you.
The point you're making is that surveillance exists everywhere. What we're saying is what the IoT does, right, is that you place it in the most secluded aspects of your life, right? When you have a TV in your living room, you don't expect to be watched. If that TV has
When I
a
have the
microphone,
TV in my
you now expect to be
when I
watched.
have the TV in my living room, I usually have my phone next to me or my laptop.
Argument that
Like,
we make.
Yeah, like
what is like?
We're
you're
saying,
only-
like, if
the
the government-
The point is that even if your impacts aren't zero, you access a small marginal increase in that one time you're in a living room without your laptop.
Right, like, okay, like, how often does the NSA arrest black people by using their phone conversations? It happens 0 times, that's the answer.
Yeah, like
We're talking about everyday secluded.
You
interactions.
still can't do
Okay,
that.
So you access maybe a marginal increase in everyday secluded actions with zero like empirical information as to how this is used.
What is used.
Like you're saying, you're impacting something that should already have happened, right? If we have the NSA, and you're saying discrimination should happen, you should have some empirics as to how the NSA uses information to discriminate.
There are 2.5 times more living incarcerated for surveillable offenses.
so.
No, it says they're, wait, no, that's not what the evidence says. The evidence says they are more likely to be surveilled, not incarcerated, because nobody gets incarcerated as a
It
result.
says they're incarcerated for those offenses.
So the NSA doesn't like give information to courts on like
James,
African Americans
more data,
to like on surveillance. Like, it
Okay,
doesn't make
that's
any
time.
sense.
We're gonna run our like 30 seconds of prep starting now.
Response, do you want me to put on my team? Let's do partial. Oh wait, they do want me to explain the two cards. What do you mean the decal horns? Oh, the reason is because we empower small farmers by giving them the tools. Yeah, I have that. That means they boost their education.
Okay, them and then us. Starting on them. Like we tell you in Grand Crossfire, all of their impacts are completely non-unique. For example, the phone, if I have my phone, there's no additional information from the IoT. Like I told you in Crossfire, the NSA can access 100% of phone conversations. That's literally what they're impacting you. They made that pretty clear. Additionally, it contradicts their overload response. Like David tells you in Crossfire, we store video and audio for a ton of room on every server. The NSA, first of all, can already pinpoint an audio conversation. But the reason they don't do this constantly is because it's too difficult to do so, and also this is going to become any easier. They are impacting you to something that should have already happened, but nothing has happened, which means nothing will happen. It's a marginal impact at best, so then look to our side. First, on agriculture. The responses, David already frontline. First, on price, we told you that this is only one-way tiny sensors that work together in an ecosystem sensors to detect things like rainfall and minerals. This doesn't take like hundreds of dollars to buy, right? Like it's a small upfront investment that most farmers can afford. This is fundamentally problematic for them because it means we are empowering small farmers, which directly lifts people out of inequality. If you buy their a priori framework, that is a reason to vote for us. But even then, they talk about yields and distribution being the problem. We literally solve the distribution problem because the problem right now is that first world farmers, for example, big like these big farmings with like tractors and stuff like that, are able to outprice the third world farmers. When you empower them with these cheaper technologies, you are bettering it. At best, the weighing analysis is pretty clear, right? Like right now, the schism is much bigger with technologies like tractors versus things like sensors, which are significantly cheaper than things like tractors. The upfront investment is smaller, which means we win the link into the inequality. But second, on the economy, the only response that we get is automation. Like David tells you, automation always occurs at first and dissipates in the long term as people move to higher skilled jobs. But even if that wasn't true, first of all, we don't see it occurring right now. And second of all, we explain our evidence that says we see gains the most in developing countries, which is why we see a 30% reduction in poverty. They try to like indict this evidence somehow. What the evidence says specifically is there's a $14 trillion gain every single year to the GDP, which increases every single year. And second of all, the current world GDP is around $80 trillion, not the US GDP. Don't let them misconstrue our evidence. At which point, when you look to the a priori weighing, we are winning very clearly because economic mobility has the by far biggest link into inequality. When you're lifting 30% of the population out of poverty and millions of small farmers, you're looking at inequality much better than they do. It's not about the government surveilling people and discriminating against them. It's about the fact that millions starve and millions die every single day. More problematic is social inequality and economic inequality, not the idea of surveillance. So vote for the important issues and vote for the affirmative.
Oh, I should have, yeah.
It's going to go, there are two voter issues and then our case. Time starts. So starting on their case, first on agriculture, they just try to extend that this goes to small farmers and allows them to break back the industrial agriculture. That's not our analysis. What we said is that the industrial companies get to it first. That's really critical because the price is going down. It hits the industrial companies before it hits the small farmers. And then that links into the two-part weighing I gave you in rebuttal that was not contested. Number one is that they get to it first and they lower prices. They price the small farmers out of the market before they get to the tech. James made that own analysis in his last speech. And second, he says he solves for distribution because the food goes to the developing world. But if the small farmers get priced out and the industrial agriculture gets to it first, there is no distribution to smaller countries. This outweighs because we say that small farmers make up the majority of the poor. If they're losing their jobs, losing access to this technology, and they never get the benefits they talk about. But second, on the economy, they continue extending this decrease in poverty. Remember, it's tangential. They have to prove the burden that I put in rebuttal, which is that the growth is inclusive. We say that leads to automation since 45% of jobs are at risk, and most of it goes into factories. They just say that automation goes into skilled jobs, and the final focus, what we tell you is the jobs don't come back because when we automated, we gave our factory jobs to China and India. If China and India automate, they have no one to give the jobs to. That's why they can't move up the ladder. That's why the poor get pushed down. That increases economic inequality, which is worse because we say the rich get richer and the monetary benefits mean nothing. The poor get poorer, linking back into his discrimination way. Now, on surveillance, he extends a couple of things. First, he says it's not unique because of phones. We tell you a few things. First, is that encryption is going up in those regular technologies. Second, and more importantly, if you hack into an IoT device, you compromise an entire network. So you get everything on all 60 devices on the network as opposed to the one phone. But third, we tell you when you access that phone, you only access consensual communication, like what I search online or what phone calls I make. With the IoT, you access non-consensual communication in secluded areas, which is at least a discrimination we talk about. But second, he says that there's going to be data overload. No, data overload is when you store the data. Surveillance is when you access the data. We say that when they access the data using this de-encryption, 80% of the time, that lists of minorities being discriminated against and arrested worldwide. That outweighs because Robert gives you analysis from them. He's saying you can't vote on a life's argument if you don't value every life equally. And more importantly, because there are 100 solutions to every problem, we should reject any one of those solutions that leads to any marginal increase in racism.